a research of many years, starting actually when you read the preface of the book, starting in the English garden in Munich, a long time ago when he was a student at the beginning. The book has a complicated title. It's called Co-Managing International Crises, Judgment and Justifications. I'm not so familiar with this sort of constructivist language, so I would call it Sense and Sensibility or something like that. But you will learn in this book, if I may say so at the introduction, a lot about how Germany, France, and the United Kingdom has been dealing with international crises in the last 30 years, actually. And I can tell you, when you even read only the empirical parts of this book, and as a historian, I was stuck with the empirical parts. It is fascinating to see how Markus Kornprobst interprets the action of the gladiators on the international scene, from Margaret Thatcher to Helmut Kohl, but also Tony Blair, and to a certain extent, he loves someone in the English British side, who I don't like at all. That's Douglas Hurt. He speaks a lot about Douglas Hurt and his action or non-interventionist actions in the time of the Balkan Wars and Balkan crisis. But also you learn a lot about the aspects of ethical foreign policy of Robin Cook or Tony Blair, and also about, and this is, I think, this is really something new, how these interactions of leaders and their people on the development of the processes of crisis management play an important role to understand how the actions and then also the later peacemaking work of three major powers, European powers, interact. I would love to say I don't understand what he calls compositionist pragmatism, but this is, I think, the central term of his approach to deal with these issues. But I do understand that the gladiator style theories belong more to the historians than to the political scientists, and I'm glad that he does this. And when you want to learn something also about the European Union and the actions of European Union in crisis management, international crisis management, you will be surprised to find that even the word European Union doesn't come up too often in this book. There's a good reason for this, and part of this reason is the actions of the United Kingdom, and I quote only one sentence from the book. Markus Kornprobst says, quote, "Unlike in France and Germany, the idea of Europe did not make it into the dominant British repertoire." And I fully agree that this is true. This did not change a little bit in the time of Tony Blair, but certainly not in the present day UK politics, also on the international scene. So I have to say that going from, as the title says, from judgments to justifications is a complicated way, but for the research on how to solve crisis management, this is a groundbreaking work on how to understand that decision-making in this sort of complicated arenas. And he speaks about Bosnia, he speaks about Kosovo, he speaks about the Iran, he speaks about Afghanistan, and also Iraq, tells you a lot of that might be possible. Might be possible. I'm not sure whether I understood him correctly. It might be possible that we can learn, that the leaders and the processes can learn from the managing conflicts beforehand. At least that's what you write in this. And you may know that in the theory of constructionism, some people say they are optimists. They think that it's possible to have progress on the liberal international scene. And some say, no, they turn to become skeptics now. I'm not sure whether Markus Kornprobst is more on the skeptical side or on the progressive side, but what I do know is that when you read the book, you understand that there is a possibility of making more sense of how things develop. And that's my last word really, you see it especially when you read how he writes about how the leading actors responded to Srebrenica, the genocide of Srebrenica, and how this changed the repertoire of policymakers on the European scene. I'm looking forward to the presentation, and I hope you are too. Thank you very much.
So yes, let me also say a few words about Markus Kornprobst before we start. I mean, most of you will know him very well. He's Bavarian. I don't say German, I say Bavarian. And he really, even in his studies and in his academic career, he showed his international interest. Yeah? So he started pretty locally at the University of Munich, where he did his bachelor, but then for his master's, he went to the University of Cape Town in Africa, and for his PhD to Canada, to Toronto, and his professional career then started also at Toronto, but then he moved to Ohio State in the US, and then to the UK, first Magdalen College, Oxford, well, a tie for you, and then to University College London, before he came to Vienna, which is now 10 years ago. So it's also a certain jubilee. For the last 10 years, he has been the chair of international relations here at the Diplomatic Academy. So he seems to like Vienna because he has been here for quite some time. That doesn't mean that he doesn't go abroad anymore, because if you are envying his tan, that's because he just comes back from a lecture tour in sub-Saharan Africa in many countries. Before that, he was in Kazakhstan and various other stans. So he still gets around quite a lot. And when he's here, you always know it because you can hear his laughter all over the place. And that's why I think he's not only that, he's a rather uplifting personality and very popular with students, colleagues, and the administration even. But sometimes when he's in Vienna, he escapes to coffee houses or libraries, and that's when he writes his numerous articles. Yeah? So I wanted to mention a few, but I saw that it's 11 pages, so I don't. But he also writes many books. I remember when he came here for his first talk 10 years ago, he had just published the books on irredentism, also with Cambridge University Press, and he gave the talk on that subject. And since then, he has published 3 books. This is the 3rd one. The last one was about understanding diplomacy. And now we hear about co-managing international crises. So, Markus, I'm looking forward to your lecture.
No, so thank you so much for the very, very kind introduction. And thank you for coming here. And I've really done a lot of talking in all kinds of different places now, I think on 3 different continents in the last 3 months or so. And it's really wonderful to do this here. And it does remind me now a little bit actually of the first lecture that I gave in my inaugural, really 10 years ago. And I really can't believe how fast everything went. If you would have been a student here something like 5 or 6 years ago, there would have been something along those lines as a seminar title. So I actually learned a lot from you students and quite a few ideas that are in this book. They're really from the seminar. And yeah, especially, I mean, one of the chapters actually, the Afghanistan chapter, really comes basically out of that seminar that I taught. As a way of introducing this book, let me just tell you a few things about the title and the image that you see there. And look at the image very closely, then there are these little sticks, and they are in blue. And you may think they were broken, but they were actually not really broken. They never fitted together, if you look very closely. And that's one of the key arguments. So that if the first hunches of leaders do not fit together, if the prejudgments go into different directions, there's very, very little hope that they can accomplish something together. Now, these first hunches, prejudgments, they're never going to coincide 100%. There'll always be quite a lot of heterogeneity. And justifications can take care of that up to a point. So justifications push and shove the political judgments of leaders. That, in a nutshell, is the argument. And then I always get reprimanded from Mr. Bujak, who's taking photos here, that the titles of my talks here are too complicated. And yes, the co-management is complicated. That's a term that I did not invent, but I use it for the first time in the sphere of international security. It usually comes from environment. And the idea behind that is a very simple one, that if we look at international crises and how states actually deal with international crises, then for the most part, it's not one state by itself that tries to deal with an international crisis, but it usually is several of them. And they try to manage a crisis together. Now, I'm going to tell you quite a few things about Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, and Iraq. And there were quite big coalitions of states involved there, and sometimes they managed to do something together, and sometimes they did not. If we look at, say, what's been happening more recently in Syria, in Yemen, you could think of all kinds of examples, then usually there are several states involved, and at times they try to do things together. At times you also get competing coalitions, but nevertheless you do get coalitions. Yeah? So this is where the book departs from the existing literature. Also departs, if you look at newspaper articles and pundits, really looks at the question of how states manage crises together. Under what conditions do they succeed in doing so? Under what conditions do they fail? Now, the first point of what I want to do, I gave away already. That's just looking at co-management, managing international crises together. There are two other important points. There is the point about figuring out what to do. So there's very little contestation that leaders really matter in situations of crisis. Even if you look at the constitution of countries, but even more so if you look at practices, political practices, and in crisis situation, decision-making authority moves upward. So therefore, if you study international crisis, you have to look at leadership. But how do they actually tick? So we have had lots of discussions here about how, say, Donald Trump ticks or does not tick. And there are lots of other actors that you could think about, they really made a difference, even going down in diplomatic history, and there's probably something that explains their doings, how they make sense of something, how they make decisions. And this, to this very day, remains a very, very contested issue, and you get all kinds of different scholarly concepts about that. So you get the macroeconomists, or also the microeconomists for the most part, and they say everything is about calculation. And then you get the political psychologists, cognitive psychologists, and they allude to metaphors, analogies, simple decision-making rules, standard operating procedures. Then you get people who look at communication, especially between advisors and leaders. You get people who look at intuition. So there's actually, for the most part, intuitions that directs leaders in a certain way, rather than reflection, very, very careful calculation, weighing of costs and benefits. So that's an answer that I have to find when I want to deal with this co-management of international crises. Practical reasoning, how do leaders figure out what to do? And then finally, there is also this question about communication. So the ambassador actually alluded to Douglas Hurd before, and you're going to hear a little bit from me about him as well. And basically what I'm going to tell you is that he has been, if you don't look at what he actually stood for, what he stood for, highly, highly problematic. Yeah? If you want to make sense of why Srebrenica happened and no intervention happened before, Hurd had a lot to do with that. If you look at how he played strategically his cards, in terms of advising John Major and everything, then unfortunately he did a brilliant job. Yeah. So this is so advices sometimes do matter. Depends a little bit on the leader, but sometimes do matter a lot. There's obviously a movie out about George W. Bush, who I'm not going to talk about much here. And the argument there is that it was basically all Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld rather than George W. Bush. And there is probably something to that as well. So advisors can make a difference, and they obviously make a difference through communicative encounters. So those three things I have to address, and now I'm going to shock you, and I'm going to show you this slide there. And with all of those slides, I simplified things. I'm not going to go now through these slides one by everything. I'm just going to allude to the gist of it, and then you can have a look at it, and it may help you a little bit to get where in the kind of direction to which I want to go. So the basic idea is that there is something about judgments and something about justifications. To make political judgments, and I follow Hannah Arendt in that way, is subsuming particulars under universals. So let's say one universal that quite a few of those decision makers had in mind, when I'm going to talk about empirics later on, was the Munich analogy. So Munich 1938, appeasement. And the diplomatic lesson learned from that is that you cannot appease dangerous dictators. That, as a diplomatic lesson, may make quite some sense, right? The question is then, obviously, when you subsume a particular, i.e. an unfolding crisis situation, under that universal, then you actually end up equating 1938 with, say, 2002, 2003 Iraq. And then obviously can become very problematic. But one of the points that I'm going to try to drive home to you, actually, is that it's quite human, for better or for worse, to reason along those lines, although the judgments that I'm going to discuss later on are much more complex, many more universals, many more particulars. So that's the judgments. And the justifications is, well, justifying judgments. So giving reasons for them, contesting the reasons given by others. And now those judgments and the justifications are not always congruent. Far not. So a leader may figure out something, may make certain strategic decisions, and then think very, very, very carefully about how to convey them to other people, for instance, the public. So justifications in politics, let's face it, are highly strategic. Now, both judgments and justifications don't somewhere appear out of thin air. But there is a certain repertoire that is something akin to a toolkit that actors have at their disposal, and they select in given situations from that toolkit. So, for instance, you're not going to select now the appeasement analogy if you have not been socialized into it before. Talking to you students, you may have been socialized into that by Tom Rowe, for example. He may have talked to you about it. Yeah? That happens at some stage, so there is a repertoire. And even nations oftentimes have a dominant repertoire. It's always contested, but there's certain dominant ideas that drive foreign policy making and foreign policy making decisions. And now the idea about this figure there is that repertoires give rise to judgments, give rise to justifications, and then feed back again to repertoires. So everything is always in flux. When I talk later on about empirics, then I'll give you snapshots. That in a way does not do justice to the book. So it's really all about process. It's all about relational processes. Some of you may have read a very influential book by Kahneman called Fast and Slow Thinking. So that's the argument that oftentimes we act intuitively, so we don't think much about something. And at some stage, we reflect. Fast thinking, intuition, slow thinking, reflection. A variant of that is in there as well. Leaders make prejudgments, so that's the first hunch that they have, that they really do by themselves, so not listening to advice or something like that. They have a first hunch themselves, and then they enter justificatory encounters with multiple audiences. And in the process of these justifications, leaders flesh out these prejudgments. Prejudgments become more fully fledged judgments. When the language there, perimeter judgments become resonance judgments. And all of this going back and forth between judging and justification eventually leads to foreign policy decisions, leads to a certain way of managing international crises, and as an entirely unintended side effect, also contributes to reproducing that repertoire. Now, if we apply this now to crisis co-management, then again, very, very simply speaking, what you need in order for crisis co-management to happen is, number one, a certain overlap of repertoires across nations. So nations do have these strategic cultures, or however you want to put it. And if they overlap, then you have these joint resources. You basically have a common toolkit that you can pick something from. If you don't have that, then even the very foundation of reaching judgments, justifications that are somewhat related to one another is lacking. So the overlap across these repertoires is the one thing. Number two, these prejudgments of leaders, they actually have to include universals from that repertoire. So, to put that differently, overlaps actually have to be put to use. Otherwise, you're not going to move forward into a direction that is somewhat compatible. And then finally, these prejudgments, they have to be pushed and shoved in similar directions. And in that way, you get consonant judgments. And out of those consonant judgments, you can then get crisis co-management. So much about the theoretical framework. I'm not going to say now much about epistemology and methodology and everything, and I'm happy to answer questions. I'm very happy to answer questions later on if you want to know more about it, but I'll cut it for the time being. I then went ahead doing the empirical research and proceeded in 5 steps in a way. So looked first at the constellation of repertoires. So how these nationally dominant repertoires, United Kingdom, France, Germany, how they relate to one another, whether there are overlaps or whether there are no overlaps. And that chapter starts with the end of the Second World War and goes up until the crisis in Bosnia, early 1990s. And then I looked at the Bosnian crisis, looked at these prejudgments, then the more fleshed out judgments, then the structuration, how that affected the repertoire. That then makes me move to the Kosovo crisis. Again, perimeter, resonance, structuration. So how does this repertoire get affected? And again, Afghanistan, and again, Iraq. And then it's done. Yeah. So, but it's not only now studies of these 4 crises, but it's also studies of the legacies of each one of those crises and how that affected co-managing the next crisis. And there'll be quite a lot about that. Now, in very, very broad strokes, what are the big similarities, the big differences, if we look at these dominant strategic cultures, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom? then something you're going to see there is that on the one hand, France and Germany are actually quite close to one another. They really believe in Europe. And they believe in also, at the time, it's everything at the time, yeah? They very much believed in doing foreign policy together, doing foreign and security policy together. The people acting at the time, Kohl and Mitterrand, were especially strong believers in Europe. So they highlighted this overlap even more if you go on the leadership level. Because leaders, they, to some extent, they abide by what you have in the general repertoire, and to some extent, they actually go beyond that and they have the idiosyncratic understandings. So that's the big overlap there. But if you look at it, there is very little overlap when it comes to the vehicles for how to deal, the means for how to deal with an international crisis. So for France, what I wrote down, their two-pronged approach, that basically means it's quite normal that on the one hand there's diplomacy and on the other hand there's coercion. This is how you deal with an international crisis. For Germany, still to some extent, but especially at the time, it was not the case. Yeah? So everything was about the diplomacy and everything was about restraint. And the orthodox understanding was that there are constitutional provisions that prohibit Germany from military intervention elsewhere anyway, unless in very, very narrowly confined parameters. When we look now at Britain and France, then it's a little bit the other way around. Yeah? So Britain, quite Eurosceptic, and I can say a few more things about those questions and answers as well, because it may not be as easy as you may think. But when we look at the overlaps between France and the UK on the crisis management side, then plenty, yeah? So in terms of this coercion, diplomacy, this interplay is very, very much there. If we add to that international governance universal, so basically how is the nation supposed to assert itself in international politics, then there too, on the one hand, there are similarities between the UK and France. It's about this asserting oneself, the great nation, the grande nation. It's about furthering great causes. Germany, much more reluctant to do something there. When you look at things in more fine-grained manner, then there's a diversion that later on is going to become quite important. There's this British understanding of a special relationship, UK-US. And that is to some extent an identity thing, to some extent it's also strategic. So to assert yourself on the global stage via the United States. It's influencing the United States, and because of that, having influence in international politics. France doesn't have that at all. So France has this famous line of yes, friendship, yes, alliance, but no alignment. And there's always something at times about multipolarity. Yeah? So understanding about international politics is necessarily power politics, and because it is necessarily power politics, power should be distributed about equally, multipolarity. In the German case, very little of these assertive universals. And then when we look at domestic governance universals, they were important for me as well, because some leaders, for them having public opinion behind them is very important. I'll tell you more about that too. It's on the one hand not that different, yeah. So no matter whether you're a prime minister or a chancellor or the French president, you don't have untrammeled powers. So there's certain checks and balances. Depends a little bit on the political constellation what you have there. Yeah? So if you have cohabitation in France, you really have a bit of a problem. Yeah? So the French constitution tells you domaine réservé. So on paper you can do basically anything. But for the most part, you need a budget for it, and that's where the prime minister comes in, and that during cohabitation is where the other party comes in. In Germany, you usually have coalition governments. I mean, actually, we always have had coalition governments. And that also puts certain pressure on the chancellor. How they deal with that is very idiosyncratic. So different leaders deal with that very differently. And there's an interesting generational switch there. That's going to come out in my study. If you look at Mitterrand, Major, and Kohl, so the leaders in power during the Bosnian crisis, they were all about private rule. So foreign policy was to them, self-evidently, something that was to be conducted by them, and maybe experts would be consulted, and maybe even the political party to some extent would be involved, but that's it, and certainly no public opinion. Yeah, so someone like Mitterrand could not be even impressed by public opinion. He disdained it. He disdained journalists. There was only one journalist who he took seriously, who, by the way, was a realist, so quite similar to his world political thinking, Raymond Aron. If we look then later on, so we look at Chirac, we look at Schröder, and especially at Blair, then that is public rule. So leaders that traditionally have had a very difficult time asserting themselves within their own party. And because that was so difficult, they really reached out towards the public. And public consent, public opinion polls are very, very important for them to legitimize their rule, not only within the country, but also within the party, that basically, and some of those parties, they just waited for something to happen with the leader, and then rivals within the party that would strike against them. Yeah, so that's a really big difference. Later on, when we talk about Iraq in particular, then you can't explain it without taking that into consideration. Now that's the backdrop to it all. Let's look at these crises now, one after the other. So the first one I want to talk about is Bosnia. And I don't have the time now to go into lots of details about these crises. I don't think I have to. I think that you're quite familiar with them. When you look at the slide there, then you have in the left-hand corner, top, you basically have universals and prejudgments of those leaders that are about sense-making. And you see, actually quite compatible. So there is this shock that Europe relapses back into its nationalistic past, widely shared. There is, after Srebrenica, outcry because genocide returns to Europe, very much related to this relapse into the nationalistic past. When it comes then to universals, prejudgments that would help to co-manage an international crisis, that would help to concert decision-making, it gets a bit more patchy. There is this two-pronged approach, diplomacy, coercion. John Major, Jacques Chirac. Not really Kohl, far from it. John Major, on top of it, and this is where the overlap on the slide comes from, also embraces something like a restraint universal. Less principled than Kohl's, but very, very reluctant to engage in any coercive action in international affairs. When we look at what kind of role the EU should play, then it's not a big surprise, and the first hunches of Kohl and Mitterrand were to very much involve the European Union. And this, by the way, was quite important, because if you think back, those are formative years now for the European Union. You were talking about the time of Maastricht, yeah? For the European Union in general, but also for a common foreign and security policy. And then when you look down, and in red, you have those prejudgments that are really difficult to reconcile with one another. So there is no fighting against the Serbs, most importantly. That's Mitterrand. This is something he gets from a World War II analogy, by the way. Yeah? So he was deeply versed in history. And he took historical lessons very seriously, and there is this old alliance between, was this big alliance between Serbia and France, and because of that, it was a prejudgment not to fight the Serbs. Very, very, very important. There is Kohl's idea, basically rooted in national self-determination, that you have to recognize. And first of all, you have to recognize, because again, remember, this is basically time of German reunification, was shortly thereafter. And also that to him it was completely unfathomable that you recognize a state and then there would be a war across state boundaries. So for Kohl, and some of that he got from Genscher, it was quite clear if you recognize, then the conflict is going to be done with. Jacques Chirac, very much about civilizational peace. What's meant by that is he thought very hard about the kind of new security threats that would appear after the end of the Cold War. And he was very nervous about Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. And so to him it was utterly important to counter that possibility of a clash of civilizations, and therefore he talked a lot about the dialogue of civilizations. Now, when we look at how all of this played out, then different actors were successful at different points in time to assert themselves in terms of the justifications. So very briefly, when it comes to recognition, I mean, neither John Major nor François Mitterrand were convinced that recognition would really solve everything happening in Bosnia and Herzegovina. But Kohl, via the Bad-Inter Commission and everything, managed to justify his way, and eventually recognition, subject to certain conditions, happened. A big step for Mitterrand was eventually to acknowledge that the Serbs were to blame. And he first came out publicly after an EU summit and saying that the Serbs are to blame, and then privately he said the Serbs are to blame from A to Z. But that is, in terms of sense-making, that was a big step as well. And we obviously had all kinds of different peace agreements and mediation efforts. And more a move from mediation towards coercive diplomacy. And there was UNPROFOR, there was Operation Deny Flight, Operation Sharp Guard, tied to the arms embargo. And it's quite interesting to see, I mean, how all of that played out. Yeah. So you see now on that slide something about Juppé. You see then later on something about Hurd. Juppé came in cohabitation, and he really tried to change this frame. He really had much more interventionist ideas than Mitterrand did. But Mitterrand defended his frame, so he defended the not to fight the Serbs frame. So these prejudgments, they really are upheld by leaders. But underneath that, he got a lot accomplished. So when we now talk about contact groups at the United Nations, for instance, that's an invention by the French under Juppé. Eventually, there was quite a lot of participation by France and by the United Kingdom in those operations that you have there. Great power status played a big role there. What also played a big role was domestic justifications, because the publics in both countries, they were really outraged that nothing happened. So slowly but surely we moved towards from humanitarian intervention and towards a more coercive diplomacy, and then eventually to the NATO ultimatum. And Douglas Hurd, now I probably have to say a few things about him there. He really played his cards very, very skillfully. Yeah? So he tried to avert, to push this possibility of NATO involvement back as much as possible. Then eventually, when it was agreed upon, there was a dual key procedure. And so he made sure that his Lieutenant Michael Rose was there in the field, and he had to report whether violations against previous resolutions had happened. He underreported quite a bit, so Hurd really very, very skillfully, very much again for the wrong cause, asserted himself there. A real game changer is then when Jacques Chirac comes in, because he is very, very much now in favor of intervention and really tries everything he can do. So he travels the United States. That is basically his diplomatic trick there. Goes to the Senate, goes to the US President Clinton at the time, talks to the Secretary of State, and tries to push the United States into taking more of an assertive stance. And this then eventually has repercussions, and eventually then more and more steps are being taken to move towards enforcement action. Rapid reaction force, the first step towards that. And John Major then, after Srebrenica, no, actually a few days before Srebrenica, fires Douglas Hurd. That was also a very important thing, yeah? And one of the reasons for that was that the UK really was internationally isolated. And sort of not so splendid isolation. And this is something, especially given the prejudgments about special relationship and everything, always being very close to the United States, that hurt Major a lot. And then eventually we moved then towards Operation Deliberate Force and the Dayton Agreement and all of that. You have a lot of elaboration there in terms of the judgments. And this was oftentimes then the United States, to some extent also Jacques Chirac, but more so obviously the United States that asserted itself. And towards the end, Chirac at times was not that happy anymore, having gone via the US route, because as he put it, they stepped on our toes all over the place. But still, in terms of moving towards intervention, there was an important strategy to play cards via the United States, via Washington. Now, all of that left the repertoire not untouched. So the authority of some of the leaders involved changed. So Jacques Chirac went up in France. Majors went down. There were other domestic reasons for that as well, obviously. This understanding that EU really matters, multipolarity matters, went up in France. A very important change in Germany was that the emphasis on restraint went down. And in the grand scheme of things, very important advocates of letting some of that go were actually the Greens, so traditionally pacifistic. And they made very clear that in the face of genocide, you cannot uphold pacifism. Another really important change was within the United Kingdom. So Blair, who obviously was not in power there yet, had very few ideas about foreign policy at the time, and Bosnia really shaped him. So Bosnia for him was a formative event in terms of how to think about international politics, how to think about international crises. And now the single most important effect in terms of structuration of the repertoires, and it's the same across the board in these three countries, was Srebrenica. So Srebrenica moved from a particular, to be addressed during the crisis in Bosnia, to a universal, to prevent genocide from reoccurring. Yeah? And this was really one of the very, very important universals that would then shape the co-managing of the Kosovo crisis. And I'm going to go faster now, because the Bosnia crisis was a very complicated one, and because the Kosovo crisis really was seen by the actors involved very much within the frame of Bosnia. So to some extent, we've done now the prep work to look at Kosovo. And again, you have in the top left corner, you have the sense-making involved. So how do leaders make sense of these, of the unfolding crisis? Well, they looked at it very, very much through the lens of Srebrenica, so to make it impossible something like Srebrenica will happen again. They now were all three of them quite assertive, because Gerhard Schröder, now in power in Germany, or soon to be I mean, right after the crisis started, basically. Very much about an assertive multilateralism. So he's really quite different from Kohl in that regard. He moves from a restraint towards a qualified restraint. So that basically enlarges the overlaps of the repertoires across the leaders here. Still no such thing as a two-pronged approach by the Germans, but at least less emphasis on restraint. The other differences, they remain in place. So about the broad multilateralism. Broad multilateralism basically means really UN, means involving the Russians amongst others as well. And also means the EU crisis management, so the focus on the European Union as an international actor. Now, when you look at, so there are quite a few convergences where you think, okay, you can make something out of that. There are also obviously quite a few divergences. And an important one is no compromises, dangerous dictators, that is Tony Blair. So Tony Blair, as sometimes referred to in the literature, had a Manichaean worldview, yeah, good, bad, evil. And this really shapes, it's not just something that comes out of his speeches, but it's really something that shapes his decision making. And now if you cast someone in an evil light, then you can't easily shake hands with that person. So in other words, you will not compromise. You're much, much less likely to compromise. Yeah? So in all of those crises now, the recurring theme will be that Blair demonizes the other leaders, and therefore is much, much more hawkish than the other. Demonizes Milosevic, demonizes then the Taliban, and then later on Saddam Hussein. It's not to say that, say, Schröder didn't think that they were bad people, or that Chirac didn't think that they were bad people, but there was no demonization. Then the rule via the special relationship for Blair, very, very important. Blair wanted to stand tall on the international stage, and standing tall for him had a lot to do with working via the United States. And if you're ever interested in that, then obviously in the United Kingdom, it's publicly available, all of those cables and things that he sent to George W. Bush during the Iraq War, and he really saw himself as the hegemon whisperer. So very, very, very much this rule via the special relationship. Multipolarity now for Jacques Chirac becomes more and more important. And the civilizational peace also becomes more important, which means, amongst other things, that there always has to be a civilian element in co-managing a crisis. Now, the disagreements, to some extent, are harbingers of what would happen later on. So keep them in mind, because when we talk about Afghanistan, we talk about Iraq, and they're going to come back over and over and over again. During the Kosovo crisis, co-management actually proceeded quite swiftly. And it proceeded quite swiftly because, in terms of the sense-making, seeing everything in light of Bosnia, they shared a lot in common. And because in terms of restraint and everything, Germany had become a little less absolute. And when you look at how things happened, then there was a Kosovo verification mission, extraction force fairly early on. And that pushed Kohl at the time. The NATO ultimatum is actually fascinating if you want to look at that, especially for the German case, also the French one. So Chirac went a bit on the brakes, nevertheless then conceded to the US and to the UK. Kohl was convinced in a series of bilateral talks, and then lost his elections. And then he requested Schröder and Fischer, so then the foreign minister, or the soon-to-be foreign minister, to come in. And he said, you know, there will be this NATO ultimatum, and you have to agree to that. So in terms of raison d'etat, this is what you've got to do, no matter where you stand ideologically. And the two of them, they simply nodded to one another, and that was it. Yeah? So they didn't take much time to decide that they would go for that. This caused then massive problems for them domestically, because they had to go through parliaments to have participation there, which is tiny, by the way, but in the grand scheme of things, to have it authorized. And early on, they did that with the old composition of the Bundestag, so where the conservatives still had the majority. And then later on, they did it with a new one. Schröder himself never addressed the party properly there because no one would listen to him. It was quite clear to him. He had certain people who had reputation within the party did the work for him. And Fischer was physically attacked at a party congress of the Greens and needed hospital treatment thereafter, so it was not easy going. Yeah? Also important to keep that in mind for later on. Chirac was very skillful diplomatically early on in the crisis. So, for instance, making sure that enforcement would not happen all too quickly, always trying to bring Russia in. And his basic vehicle for that was in the peace talks in Rambouillet. Carefully prepared also for the EU to have some kind of a role to play. Austrian diplomats at the time in the EU, for the EU, Wolfgang Petrich played an important role there. But as soon as the play had started on that stage that Chirac had prepared, he lost control over it. And it was very much the United States and the United Kingdom that asserted themselves. And Christopher Hill, US diplomat, basically drafted the peace agreement. That peace agreement was not acceptable, so was not accepted by the Serbs. We can also go into that in more detail later on why that may have been the case. And then we moved towards war, peace enforcement. So always this exceptionalization. So there's really Chirac and Schröder now really pushed into a corner, elaborating on their prejudgments, but at the same time always very, very carefully to defend at least some of it. And you see that in terms of Chirac, for instance, when he oftentimes objected to certain targets of the bombardments and also not contributing probably the way he could have. Eventually, then you have a peace plan. But the peace plan is quite interesting. That's an opening that Chirac and Schröder use. So US and the UK, when the bombardments took place, did not take care all that much about thinking about moving back to the diplomatic route. Blair at the time very much preparing his campaign to introduce ground forces, ground troops. And at that time, then Schröder and Chirac moving in. That to some extent, by the way, was really something like trying to save themselves domestically. Yeah? So this peace enforcement early on was popular in all the countries under scrutiny here. But the more bombs dropped, the more the media turned against it, and the more difficult, and the more the public opinion polls went against intervention, and that actually could have cost Schröder his job, and for Chirac it was very difficult too. Yeah? So that was a motivation to open up the diplomatic route, and then it was at the end a little bit on Blair's side to track back. Lessons learned by that. I'm going to start with the UK because that's the most. A lot happened there. So Blair's authority goes up dramatically. Yeah? So people are really impressed across the board by how he managed that crisis in the United Kingdom. A Blairization of the dominant repertoire happens. So more emphasis on special relationship, more emphasis on ethical foreign policy becomes quite tangible. So becomes more and more obvious. Blair gets more and more confidence in his public leadership, very important too, yeah? And his public leadership is not just, okay, making sure somehow that people are going to agree with the justification here or there. No, he really wants to script the crisis. And he does that with the help of Alistair Campbell, so his spin doctor. And when a NATO bombardment starts, then Campbell, with his aid, is dispatched from London to Brussels, NATO headquarters. So scripting the crisis is very, very important for Blair, and he did that very successfully. Yeah. So in other words, his self-confidence in terms of what he could achieve, in terms of how he could turn around public opinion, that really increased quite dramatically. Another one that happened was this idea of liberal interventionism. So if you hear him now reflect upon his foreign policy, and he really highlights liberal interventionism, that is his big idea, humanitarian intervention. And he put together some kind of a doctrine during the Kosovo crisis, which he publicly announced in the United States. And is, by the way, basically written by a professor whom he knew quite well from the London School of Economics. Now, in the German case, restraint goes further down, so that would be important then to have overlaps later on again with Britain and with France. Schröder finds his self-confidence affirmed, so he played much more of a role than Kohl did. So in a way, his self-confidence goes up as well. And Chirac, a little bit disturbed by Blair and always siding with the United States and oftentimes against France. And to some extent, there's also a Chiracization of the dominant French repertoire. So there's more emphasis, especially on multipolarity. Yeah? So this idea that you don't necessarily always align yourself with the United States. The crisis happening thereafter, obviously, in terms of character, very different. Yeah? So thus far, we've talked about 2 civil wars, and now we're moving to regime change, actually. And Afghanistan obviously has a lot to do with September 11. Sorry, that's the wrong one. And Afghanistan obviously has a lot to do with September 11. And after September 11, the first leader, but I was pre-scheduled already, to go to Washington was Chirac. And it's really interesting. So if you read through the kind of reassurances that Chirac, Schröder, and Blair make to the United States, to George W. Bush, it is all about solidarity, unconditional solidarity, unlimited solidarity, and so on and so forth. It's no coincidence that they use basically all the same language. This is kind of language that was suggested to them by their embassies in Washington, the kind of expectations that the Americans would have. It's obviously quite strong language. Then all 3 of them quite assertive, but nevertheless knowing very well that the United States is very, very much in the driver's seat here. There are also looming a couple of incongruences here. Yeah? So Blair, way before September 11, was already thinking about post-Cold War threats, and it was basically all about weapons of mass destruction, and it was all about international terrorism. So there's nothing that happened at September 11 or thereafter. It was already before. There's obviously, again, the no compromises, dangerous dictates or regimes. There's, again, obviously, the rule via the special relationship. There's much, much more now to have this grand leadership for Blair. And with Chirac, we have again the same differences in terms of civilizational peace. So for the war against terror, that meant much, much more emphasis on the non-military aspects of the war on terror. And the multipolarity, we talked about this already quite a bit. Now, the international justifications sent by the United States, they really resonated with the 3 leaders. So they all hardened their judgments about standing by the United States. At the same time, Chirac and Schröder listened to their advisors that in terms of this unlimited solidarity, should not go too far. Yeah? And this is when Schröder, for instance, announced in Parliament that they would stand with the United States during the war on terror, and they would do all kinds of things, but not engage in any adventures. That's a quote. And that would become later on important as well. Then Operation Enduring Freedom happens. Schröder again has to go through Parliament and basically gets the authority then to dispatch 100 special forces. Basically, when the war is already over. Yeah. Even in order to do that, he used all kinds of tricks to get that passed. He basically he did put his job online and linked it to a non-confidence vote. So he really tried very, very hard to stand by the US there. He's very disappointed that that was not acknowledged by the George W. Bush administration. When it comes to the peace talks, yet again there is this pattern. Domestic justification pressures to move towards peace as soon as possible. And again, Schröder and also Chirac, they jump on any kind of opportunity to move into that direction. They do that eventually successfully. Now, to what extent did that change things around? The general reproduction and the general reshuffling of this repertoire simply continued, same as after Bosnia, same as after Kosovo. A few differences, obviously. So September 11 becomes a universal. And another important difference is that Chirac and Schröder now had their experiences with the George W. Bush administration. And they really boiled down to massive distrust. And that you may say that's an emotional thing or something, but in the grand scheme of things, that would prove rather important later on. With Blair, it was an entirely different matter. Blair now really was, in his opinion at least, at the height of his leadership position internationally and also domestically. And if you look at domestic politics, there was really no quarreling anymore in the UK. And if you look at the House of Commons now, then there are all kinds of contestations, screaming and yelling across the aisle. That is actually something that is very much of the nature of the House of Commons, but did not happen during the Afghanistan intervention. Did not happen during the Kosovo intervention either, by the way. Yeah? It was very, very successful in terms of securing an overall consent. And this Blairization of the dominant repertoire that continued as well. And then we're finally with Iraq, and again that's quite a complex case, but I'll cut it quite short. The big difference now, if you look at the other slides, then it was that in terms of the sense making, they were actually pretty compatible, yeah? So they made sense of the crisis in very similar ways. They did not do so with regard to Iraq. That is one really big difference, yeah? So, so for Schröder and for Chirac, that could be an issue of weapons of mass destruction, but it was not a foregone conclusion. For Blair, it was very much a foregone conclusion. There was something about international terrorism that Schröder and Chirac did not buy into. Blair not all that much either, but a little bit. And then there was obviously the humanitarian intervention bit that for Blair played quite a role, liberal interventionism, and much less, or not at all, in terms of an intervention, a cause for intervention, for Chirac and Schröder. Then all of them wanted to play a major role, but that in that case was not necessarily a good thing, because if you end up on different sides and it's playing a different role, it's going to highlight differences rather than diminish them. And then you have all of these other things, the distrust of the Bush administration, the broad multilateralism, so go via the United Nations, to have the EU assert itself in that crisis. So when you look at it, lots and lots of convergences between the French and the Germans there, but not including the United Kingdom. And the flip side of that coin is then the disagreements that you have in RAID. So again, you have this Blair being alert about weapons of mass destruction, international terrorism, for quite a while, more so than the other two. You have again this demonization. You have again the rule via the special relationship. And you have this very assertive leadership on Blair on the other side, and so on. Now, yet again, there is the story that Chirac, similar to the Kosovo, actually played his diplomatic cards very skillfully early on in the crisis. So some of you may remember how everything unfolded, 2002, 2003, and the frame was 2 resolutions. And that frame was basically set by Jacques Chirac. Yeah? So first, to make clear to Saddam Hussein that he has to comply with the disarmament regime, and if there's no compliance, then there would be a second resolution. That second resolution would authorize the use of force. But there would have to be a second resolution. And that frame basically locked Blair and it locked Bush in. So that was in that way very successful. And then you obviously had then an international aspect to that too, quite an important one, with Brix, El Baradei and everything, so where weapons inspectors then were in charge of verifying things. Saddam Hussein was supposed to hand over documents. And there was nothing about non-compliance there. So there's this lack of the smoking gun, as it was sometimes referred to. And that made Chirac and Schröder now more and more reluctant to engage in a more coercive crisis management mode. There's obviously also a domestic politics story attached to that. Yeah? So there were elections in Germany at the time, and in the book I write about the loud opposition. So Schröder did not just oppose, but he was very loud in opposing, and that obviously had to do a lot with the elections. In my opinion, or my argument, it's not the actual saying no to intervention, but it's the way how he said no. That is due to the election, an electoral campaign. So his advisors, the important advisors for him at the time, were no longer diplomats or something like that. It was Thomas Steg, was basically his Alistair Campbell. Interesting twist in the United Kingdom as well. I mean, we obviously know all of this. So there was a dossier here and a dossier there. And Blair started with exactly the same hunch that he had with Kosovo and to some extent also Afghanistan. So make clear to the public that there are these huge human rights abuses, and that will rally the nation around the flag in terms of going to war. And early on, there was a spike, 2002 still, when this first dossier was published. But then his advisors came in and they said, no, legally speaking, we cannot go to war over this human rights stuff here, but it has to be something about weapons of mass destruction. And then Blair reframed everything according to weapons of mass destruction, and that never resonated. So this is when the British invented wonderful terms like the dodgy dossier and all of that. Yeah? So people did not take that seriously. And it's only then in February, 15th of February, when the big anti-war demonstrations take place, that Blair is so cornered that he doesn't care about this advice of international lawyers anymore. That played a role then in a public inquiry later on. And then he resorts to the humanitarian frame. And with help of the humanitarian frame and other things as well, he manages to get the nation rally around the flag, at least temporarily at the onset of the war. The rest of this obviously is basically history as we know. Yeah? So things did not go all that well. No smoking gun was discovered even after the intervention. So that's basically the end of Blair's political career. It's also the end of the Blairization of the British repertoire. Others did considerably better. Yeah? So Chirac and Schröder did considerably better. Amongst other things, I mean, Schröder's re-election probably had quite a few to do with his Iraq stance. And reproduction of friendly relations between Germany and the US, there were interrupted, to put it mildly, afterwards. So even after the intervention, there was very little repair work to be done because relations were so bad. There was very little repairing that could be done. With Chirac and George W. Bush, it was a bit different. They were more pragmatic about it. So that's it. Just to sum up very, very quickly, what I wanted to talk to you about is I wanted to say that when we look at international crises and how states deal with international crises, is a very fruitful way of looking at how they succeed or fail, and yes, oftentimes they fail, to manage international crises together, because that's what states do. They usually try to manage them together. Even coalition building or something is an attempt, perhaps a hierarchical one, still an attempt to manage them together. Second one, we can talk about security governance there. Yeah? I'll leave that up for questions and answers. Those four crises, they were not just crisis management, it's not the only important outcome of it. It also has repercussions for NATO, for instance, to this very day. Because by doing certain things together, we may accomplish certain things in the future. But if there are certain disruptions, then that has certain legacies. The third one, that is for those of you interested in international relations theory, I've not done now a lot of over-conceptualized scholarly pigeonholing, boxing or something like that. But I proposed very, very broad concepts, deliberately so, for you perhaps quite abstract. But they're very broad because if we look at political acts, the way they judge has a very, very broad scope. And it really depends on who we want to make sense of, whether they say are all about public governance or private governance, whether more into restraint or more into military affairs and all of that. So that's the point about broadening things up there. But I'll stop now. Thanks a lot for listening to this, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Okay, so thank you very much. That was a very classic interdisciplinary talk. You saw a lot of history, you saw a lot of theory, political science. So we go immediately into the discussion. I think there are a few designated discussants, so maybe you want to start.
Thank you so much, Professor, for your talk. You really illustrate how deep we can go in the analysis with these scholarly concepts. And I suppose I'm kind of lucky because I'm familiar with a few of these concepts from your previous work that I've read for my own thesis. I was just wondering why you chose Germany, France, and the UK, and could the next edition of your book perhaps be all five P5 members?
Should I go straight away? No. Oh yeah, I'd love that. No, I chose these three because literature often refers to them as the big three of the European Union. It will at some stage no longer refer to them as the big three of the European Union. I still think, especially because of Brexit, I think that the study can tell us something, because I think that the rest EU has to be quite realistic about things. So without Britain, it will be a much weaker international player. There's no question about it. And when push comes to shove, that's also something that comes out of the book, and the ambassador alluded to that already. There's not all that much about the EU in there. So yes, there are some EU summits that may have contributed to something. But when there are really these big international crises, then you don't go the normal route somewhere via Brussels. And I do think that if we and when we face the next big international crisis, that it will not be just about the EU member states to do things, but I think it will be of crucial importance that they do something together with Britain. And that has nothing to do now with deal or no deal or something like that, because we are in the international security sphere. And more about your question about the P5, yes, that would be a great one. I'd probably start crying if I would do this kind of research. But because there's obviously not all that much happening about it of late. But one thing that's interesting about it, if you read the UN Charter, then strictly speaking, the United Nations Charter gives authority to the members of the permanent members of the Security Council, also the other ones, but especially the permanent ones because of the veto power, to take care of international peace and security. So, in other words, very easy, yeah? In other words, if there is an international crisis, then those five really are the guardians of international order, qua international law. And one would hope that they would get their act together. That they don't is a different matter, but you're absolutely right. I mean, looking at these five with a framework like that would be a very interesting thing to do.
Thank you, Mr. Kornprobst, for sharing your insight and presenting the book. My question actually relates to EU as like the countries co-managing crises together. And the first one is, if the great power statuses that you talked about are very, very strong, and then there are no game changers like, for example, Chirac in the game to actually shift maybe a repertoire where we can see this is clearly going wrong. What is needed, or how in this situation do you shift a repertoire before this repertoire maybe countervenes other repertoires that you follow in order not to create a too strong counter-narrative? Do you understand my question? I can try to explain it in a practical example that I'm thinking of in your presentation.
Yeah.
So basically, what I'm thinking of is that the EU, and most certainly maybe Germany, uses the Holocaust as a particular to apply it to the universal basically of protection and support of Israel in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for example. And this historic repertoire is used as a legitimization of how EU acts. But at the same time, there is this other repertoire of the EU being based upon liberal values and democracy, so on and so forth. But through relying, or by relying on this historic repertoire, there is another particular created, which is that there is an acceptance of a settlement policy, for example, and also a deterioration of a situation in Palestine which cannot be accepted, which countervenes the second repertoire of human rights. So basically my question goes to say that if there are repertoires shared by many states in the EU that they all agree on, that are important to the EU, that contravene each other, how do we shift this if there is a too great power structure that can, for example, the US, that can't be contravened?
Yes, no, that's a good question. So with these repertoires, you can't easily intervene there. Yeah? So they really evolve over long periods of time. And they really usually evolve by doing things. Yeah? So there's only that much you can now consciously try to change things around. Let's say, there's a different example now, yeah? But let's say in terms of public understandings about, say, Austrian foreign policy identity, neutrality is very important. And in the past, there were sometimes people saying, okay, maybe that's not that useful now for what we do, or we have to reinterpret. To some extent, it has been reinterpreted, but it's still there. So they're very sturdy, yeah. And now, in terms of the question about the Middle East that you raise, I mean, that would be up to empirical research, yeah? So to what extent now nationally dominant repertoires, to what extent they converge on certain positions on the Middle East. But my hunch is they are not necessarily that far apart. But given the crisis situation, there's probably not all that much that the Europeans could could add. They're not necessarily a big recognized actor, you know? I mean, none of them actually.
No, but doesn't, if the EU continues acting, like continues upholding the historic repertoire of the Holocaust, in this sense, they run too big of a danger to counteract through accepting such things as the settlement policies, for example, that they counteract and they run a risk.
But basically, so for me, so in my framework, the Holocaust is a universal. Yeah, so that it's really something that is in the repertoire, and thinking about it guides your decision making. And I really hope it will for the next 5,000. No, let me just finish. I really hope it will for the next 5,000 years. Yeah, I mean that's really. And if there's any, it's probably the single most important lesson in international politics ever. Yeah? But that doesn't mean that this is all there is to a political judgment about the Middle East. Yeah. So there are lots and lots of other ones, and judging has a lot to do with trying to reconcile different universals in a particular moment in time. So you're going to emphasize some more and some others. And so I really don't think at all that the Holocaust universal stands in the way of a reasonable policy towards the Middle East. On the very contrary, I think it's for me it's the absolute cornerstone. But obviously there are lots of other ones as well. Yeah? I mean, in terms of human rights, in terms of democracy, it's just that the question is to what extent, what are the universals there? Yeah? So the European Union has generated now 2 supposed grand strategies. Yeah, they were agreed upon, but were basically drafted by certain think tanks, then elaborated on through political processes, and then the question is whether they actually really make much of a difference on the ground, because just because something is written in a grand strategy, a global strategy, or European security strategy, does not mean that it is actually in the repertoire. Does not mean that it's a cornerstone of your thinking.
Yeah, because this is a follow-up question. You talked about the tools of co-managing crises. So you have diplomacy, obviously peace agreements. If you see that these peace agreements don't work and the diplomatic efforts between the conflicting parties don't work, and you then start using coercive, you called it coercive diplomacy, the other one? No. You start using coercive measures, for example, the isolation of Hamas and hoping for the deterioration of Gaza or whatsoever. And you also see that this doesn't work. What are the other tools? Are there any other tools?
So you're asking me a normative question now about how crisis co-management is supposed to work. That's not what I do in the book, right? So the book is really analytical.
But what is your opinion on?
So I want to explain how it happens. Yeah, and the normative one is a really broad one. Yeah, so that's really have to make then a big argument about humanitarian intervention. And that's probably going. I mean, my own hunch is that once upon a time, with the responsibility to protect, we were on the right way. Yeah. But because of the way how that principle has been implemented in Libya, we have left that way, which to some extent goes a little back to what Hillel said beforehand. Because there's certain so when you look at Security Council dynamics, then there's certain things that really disturb those dynamics quite a bit. Yeah? And Kosovo intervention was the one, because obviously there was no mandate by the Security Council. And Libya was another one, because obviously this resolution was not implemented the way it was.
Maybe you can share your normative ideas on it later, because I'm writing my thesis on it and it will interest me a lot.
I'm happy to do that.
So I'm interested in the repertoire about crisis itself, and whether you were thinking about that, because all your questions, or like your case studies, are about interventions and moments in time when there's the judgment is to either intervene, to drop a bomb, or to not drop a bomb. in very simple terms, but basically. But what about crises that, and I'm thinking about global warming here, what about crises that aren't as, let's say, realist in the terms of like materialist power that you impose upon a state? And how do the repertoires that have evolved about international crises that are involving interventions, how do you see them playing out and informing crises that are different from them?
Yeah, that's an important question. So a crisis is something where actors perceive that something that they hold very dear to their heart is at stake. And if they don't act very, very, very fast, then things are going to deteriorate much, much more. Now, given that definition of a crisis doesn't have to revolve around intervention, peace and war. No, it can be about migration, it can be about health, it can be about environment, it can be about economics, it can be about all sorts, absolutely. And that's in the book on Agenda for Further Research. It's just the only thing that is important in terms of applying this, it really has to be a crisis. So for normal politics, there are so many other actors that you can't really sustain, in my opinion, this very nuanced focus on a particular leader. Yeah. But so let's say you want to study global economic governance or something like that, then you have so many actors in there that's just impossible. Yeah. But I think if there's a crisis moment, then no matter what that is, then this could be applicable. But I have not done the research, so it would be up to others to try that.
But do you think that the repertoires cross over from one? Like, does it matter what kind of crisis is for the repertoire that is being used, or is the
some do, some don't? So let's say so what I have about the domestic governance and the international governance, that does not cross over, and even in terms of the ordering universals, should still be applicable, but not the crisis management ones. So the crisis management ones, because I only looked at these military ones, is different. And there should also, let's say, if you look at climate change, then there should also be something, there's science and everything in there that pertains to models on climate change and global warming and all of that. That obviously is not in there now. Yeah? So one would have to look at the constellation anew. But a couple of things, they should still be applicable. Yeah? And I think not to forget, yeah, this is really all time contingent. Yeah. So when I look at this constellation, I don't make the argument, now this is how British, French, and German repertoire is in our days. It's not. If we look at this now, then quite a few things have changed in all of the cases. Yeah, it's just at the time. And then again, I mean, if you think about climate change, think about how important leaders can actually be. Yeah, so say Obama, Trump. It does make a difference.
I'll sit on later.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you very much for your talk. I think by the end of it, we finally understood what the slides were about. But my question is actually about exactly what you were talking about right now. So what are the repertoires and judgments that leaders are using at the moment, especially maybe with regard to the slowly unfolding crisis that we are seeing in Iran? Do you think that leaders are still drawing on these, like Iraq, for example, where this dossier suddenly showed up? Or is it now things like Libya and Syria and Yemen that they're drawing on? And also, how do you think that this crisis of multilateralism that we are seeing at the moment plays into this concept of co-managing?
Yeah, they're also very good questions. I just have to be a bit careful so that I always highlight that it's about this crisis. Yeah. So what's happening with Iran right now? So given a strict scientific definition of a crisis, not a crisis yet, fortunately. Yeah. I mean, but I mean, certain things are suggestive about it. Yeah. Let's say you want to make sense of it. So there is a president that tries to have some kind of a rapprochement with Iran, American President Obama, and then there is the next one who does the exact opposite. Then how do you make sense of that? Yeah, so if you just want to go now, say, the national interest or something, then that's not obvious why this should have changed now 100%. Yeah? So leadership probably is quite important there. And if I would do now the study on that, which I haven't done, but if I would do the study on that, then I would really have to look at certain formative moments. Say 1979, Iran hostage crisis, for instance, because that really was a big punch in terms of US-Iranian relations, and to some extent, these and that comes out there quite nicely. I mean, nice is not nice is the wrong word, but so there's this being locked into hostile relations. That is now, if one would take a pure rational choice. I always look at Werner when I say rational. If you take a pure rational choice view, it's not all that rational. Yeah, but as soon as you put cognitive psychology and everything in there, and if you think about these universals in particulars, then it becomes a bit more intelligible. It sometimes is a universal, can be really something like an entrenched enmity, something like a sentiment against someone, and so if you want my opinion about Iran, yeah, then that's not my opinion. It's something to, not only opinion, is a different research project, yeah. But the so-called Iranian nuclear deal is the most thorough verification mechanism that has ever been imposed onto a state in the nuclear non-proliferation regime. I mean, by a huge margin. So if you jeopardize that agreement, then you will not have this verification mechanism. That begs the question: what else are you going to have? But the patterns say, so if you compare that across time, Iranian nuclear deal now, agreed framework agreement 1990s, it's the same. Yeah. So there's an agreement, and lots of these underlying distrust and enmity and everything is just not there. And the agreements, they're always based on the assumption that the one side implements a little, the other one reciprocates, and so on and so forth. And you can very easily derail that. So you just don't reciprocate at a particular moment in time, or you raise your suspicions, or you doubt a certain legal provision, or the provision of that in terms of binding, non-binding, everything, and then the thing disintegrates. And this is definitely where we are. Yeah? But in terms of and that obviously may become a crisis. But it's also interesting to note that thus far, you're pushing me a little bit towards, or maybe I'm willing to talk a bit about Trump there. Yeah? I mean, thus far, he does not seem to be militarily adventurous. Yeah. So he bullies and he barks, but thus far he hasn't bitten, not all that much. So there's some hopeful sign there. Yeah. By the way, with Trump, if you wanna do an analysis like that, then you have to look at the way how he's been socialized. And that's the New York real estate market. And this is where the zero-sum economics probably comes in, and this is where very different lens comes in, but it is not, I mean, hopefully, yeah, that's not necessarily where a military element comes in.
This gentleman in the last row.
Bringing particulars and the universals thing. I believe it's first of all a Kantian theme. I'm not sure if you're aware of that, but in the Critique of Pure Reason, there's a passage where Kant writes about bringing, I'm not sure what, but I believe it was appearances under concepts, and I think the bringing of particulars and the universals might be derived from that. I actually recently quoted the whole bringing particulars and the universals in one of my recent papers. Where did you get it from? Because was it Strawson or Sellers? Do you remember?
I do, but I'll let you finish.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
And the second point, it's a bit of a darker one. I don't want this to be misunderstood as a criticism of you or your book, but I'm under the general impression that when, the more war-happy factions of the West and NATO states talk about the management or maybe also co-management of crises, I think what they're actually doing is creating or exacerbating the crises. I mean, it started in Yugoslavia and got progressively worse. And look at Iraq. I mean, there was, for instance, the motivation, as far as I heard, that Saddam Hussein was selling or trying to sell oil in euros in 2002, if my resources are correct, and that's of course something the US did not want to see. That was certainly one of the reasons for why they wanted to stamp him out. It's also one of, I mean, I'm not sure if you're aware of the Eisenhower exit speech, where he warned about the military-industrial complex. I mean, it's been a situation of the tail wagging the dog, so to speak, which is also, by the way, the title of a movie, which was filmed in the early 1990s with Robert De Niro, and which also, where the plot also was, well, the United States ran out of enemies, and now who do we wage war against? There were quite a few of those movies, and also, when you look at Iran, I also believe it's not crisis management, it's crisis creation, what the United States is doing. And also Iraq and Libya, like you mentioned, Syria, that's crisis creation, or at the very least crisis exacerbation. What do you say about that?
It was a lot now, so what did I write down there? So you're right, so the term Urteilskraft is Kant's. And he refers, just very briefly, because maybe I could go on about it forever because I love it, but not everyone may share that passion. But so with Kant, it was about aesthetic judgments. And it was Hannah Arendt who applied Kant to politics, so political judgments. And this subsuming particulars on the universals, I mean, that's basically what Kant writes, although he didn't put it like that verbatim. And then it's Ronald Biener in a book 1983 on political judgment who played around with that a bit, and I draw from that too. In terms of exacerbate and everything, so that's a long-standing debate, yeah. So with this intervention, yes, I mean there are cases in which intervention makes things much worse, yeah. There are other cases in which intervention, even humanitarian intervention, in my opinion at least, worked. Yeah. So let's say, in my opinion, always quite a clear-cut case is Tanzania, Uganda, Idi Amin. Yeah? I mean that really put an end to that. Yeah, and probably for the better. Yeah. Other interventions, yes, they cause all kinds of problems thereafter, and you've alluded to quite a few of them. So while there was a lot of enthusiasm about this intervention in the 1990s, it's quite clear by now that all kinds of battles were won, but the wars may have been lost, quite a few of them. Yeah, and if one looks at, say, Libya now, or which you mentioned, I mean that's obviously massive problems with statehood. And a few months ago I trained junior Libyan diplomats, and the original idea was to do that in Tripoli. And then I said, no, I'm not going to do it in Tripoli. So then we did it in Djerba, so in Tunisia. And I mean, whoa, I mean, so it's a very, very heterogeneous group of people. So basically every militia sends a few people, plus obviously people who have been in the service for a very long time, and they're very professional. And I got quite I mean, so you spend a week with them, and it was a very nice group actually. And then they went back, and 2 days later, then a bomb exploded on the foreign ministry. Yeah. So there's all kinds of stuff happening that is very disheartening. I agree with you. Yeah. But I think it's what my hunch about this is that I very much stay away from absolute answers. So I don't think, although I empathize with pacifism, I really do. I think that a complete pacifism is just not cutting it either. I think there are cases where intervention is the better way to go ahead. But in the past, obviously, we've had all kinds of interventions that were not all that necessary. And when they were carried out, they were not necessarily carried out in a way that the state afterwards would be able to move forward. I fully agree with you there.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. I am Joshua Truss from the organization called PhD Promoting Human Development. So we are working to promote human development worldwide. First thing of all, I'd like to say thank you to you for this presentation. It's so interesting, and still because I'm also working in the topic like this, democracy in international affairs, and I'm very interested for this topic. So in your presentation, you speak mostly about Germany, France, UK, US, and a little bit about Russia. I can say it coming like the P5. And you speak about German P5 plus 1. My first question is this: what is the place of China in international crisis solving? First question, that is. And the second question is that, does this, let me call this P5 or the UK, Russia, France, and the US, let me call them P5 in short, does this P5 consult the people for there to make decisions? Because with us, we do believe that there is no better life, someone cannot enjoy life if he doesn't make decisions about his own life by himself. If someone else can come, he can come just to advise how to make decisions. But you have already answered to this question. For me, I see that I'm interested too much to the local populations. So these P5, are them taking decisions of crisis solving, referring to the problem in the field or to their own interest? This is my second question. And what is you speak about the AU very few. What is the approach of AU in international crisis solving? But you speak mostly here about France and Germany. If I can myself conclude, I see that AU is only limited by the power makers or decision makers. As I can see, it's Germany and France. It's me who say this, but you know more perhaps than me, who are the decision maker in AU. From what I hear, what you speak, I can conclude Germany and France. So, AU, if I can say, in crisis, in international crisis solving, is only separated. Germany and France, they are separating themselves from AU to decide, or they are deciding together. So these are my three questions. Thank you very much.
Good. So one after the other. You know, so when you write a book, you can't write about everything, right? So you have to make case selections and everything, and that case selection, given those crises, that made sense to me. My next book, by the way, is on African order, global order. So the interlinkages is not about peace and security at all. Yeah? There's probably more something for you with them. But you asked the question about China as a crisis manager. That's something to watch out for, yeah. So China is obviously important when it comes to North Korea, but thus far China is very much a restrained power, yeah. And I'm saying it's something to watch out for because historically, usually major trading nations at some stage they reinforce their militaries and they think about that, yeah. Not that much has happened yet. So if you look at military expenditure or something like that. So if we look at crisis management globally, then yes, if one would want to make a study on Security Council, then and there's a major crisis there, one would have to look at China. Otherwise, one would have to look at China if something happens in the South China Sea, North Korea, and so on and so forth. Local population, I think what you have in mind is peace building. Huh? That's this definition of a crisis is really a crisis is not something that happened that lasts sort of 3-4 years or so. Yeah, there's the perception that there has to be very, very quick decision making, and the clock is ticking and all of that. Yeah. Now there obviously are these crisis moments in peace building. Yeah, but overall peace building tries to move in when the crisis is over, and try to rebuild. And yes, I mean there is a debate about to what extent you have to do bottom up, top down, and all of that, and probably more and more convergence that you have to do quite a lot of bottom up. Yeah. And then you talked. Did you mean the EU or the AU? I'm also happy to talk about the AU, the European Union. Yeah. No, I mean, so obviously, so if you look at the whole idea behind the European Union and everything, it is an important decision. It's supposed to be everyone involved. Yeah, there's no question about that. But that's of course not how it works in real politics. So especially in those crisis moments. Yeah. Because in those crisis moments, oftentimes something like a treaty on the European Union, a treaty functioning on the European Union, oftentimes doesn't really apply all that much. You have to find vehicles, say during the global financial crisis, about how to deal with things that are actually written nowhere, and then you come up with some novelty. So let's face it, there is, whether we want it or not. I mean, I don't like it, but as a matter of fact, there is power politics. And the question I asked you about the stuff about the AU, it's in any kind of regional arrangement. Yeah. So let's say in the AU, the Mauritius does not have the same say as South Africa, Nigeria, or Egypt. And so this is something to be. So if you want to analyze it, not normatively, if you want to analyze, you want to make sense about how it unfolds, then we probably have to look at that. And you would, by the way, because I'm just saying now about the AU because my other area of speciality, Africa, is that you find very, very similar regional things there. So that even if, let's say, you would look at Southern Africa and you find all kinds of things between South Africa and Zimbabwe that you'd say, okay, on the face of it, they should be able to agree upon all kinds of things, but at the end of the day, they don't.
So I think time is slowly running out, so there would be 3 questions blocked now from that table. So that gives you then the concluding statement. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'll keep it short. You mentioned judgments and justifications, the role of advisors, and the term Blairization. Essentially, I guess what you talked about reminded me very much of echo chambers and of groupthink under power politics. Mm-hmm. So, you know, the sort of being prone to expose your ideas only to like-minded people or advisors. How far would you say that's the case, particularly with Blair? Thank you.
Okay. So people keep on stealing my questions, and I'm very glad that I got the opportunity. So my question is, what's left of it, I guess, is how do you see your model working to explain how the Security Council functions in any time in the future? At the same time, how international norms are set. And methodologically speaking, could one possibly apply your model to study how different leaders react to different crises domestically? So longitudinal study, basically. Thank you.
I have two questions. The first question is, your research is very focused on states and statesmen, so it's very state-central. My question is, what is the role of non-state actors, especially NGOs, with keyword on crisis management initiative? Second question is to do with US-Iran tensions, which have been escalating recently. And a lot of talk around this rhetoric is to do solely with the US and Iran. However, there's a lot of other states who are also involved, for example, with the background of the JCPOA. So what is the role of other states in easing tensions in this instance and co-managing the crisis?
Thank you. So, lots of great questions, but you've been very patient, so I'm not going to be too long now. Echo chambers group thing, yes, absolutely. Yeah. So it's a group thing. I mean, because you mentioned Blair. Yeah. So Blair starts off basically having no idea about foreign policy, and he has Robin Cook, who becomes then his first foreign minister, and tells him all kinds of things. And over time, that left Blair a little uncomfortable because he really wants to be in charge. So at some stage, then obviously he fired him, and so the pattern with Blair is that always to get rid of people who may say something against him, and the height of that is then reached during the Iraq War. So where he only has people who are gonna say yes. So there's no meaningful discussion anymore at all. It's the groupthink. Yeah. So it's totally deficient decision making. Echo chambers is something that one really will have to look at now. So if one would do something like that again, one would really have to look at at new social media. And one would probably find an awful lot of those echo chambers. Yes, yeah. So communication, so depending on how communication plays out, decision making is more or less deficient. In good decision making, I mean, John F. Kennedy, for instance, he's been out there. For him, it was always very important that he has someone who says something completely different. He may not have liked that person, he may have treated that person awfully, but he nevertheless listened. Yeah. And that is not that is obviously not something that we oftentimes hear. I mean, if you think about, I mean, we can only guess about how things work with Trump. But it does seem that he fires people if they're not in line. Yeah, so that's also there's some hints there at groupthink as well. Groupthink, by the way, is a term that was coined by Janus in 1972. So if you have this, you only talk to like-minded people, small circle, and all you look is for affirmation. So no actual checks on your decision making. The Security Council, I said a few things about it. I'm just going to do domestic politics. Domestic politics, you could definitely apply it to, yeah. But then you really have to make a lot of adjustments, yeah. So it's obviously then the state's focus is gone. You have to look at certain groupings within a state, within a society. And then I do think you could look at it in terms of crisis making. It's just that one important difference there is that in domestic politics, if it's a functioning state, it is Roma locuta causa finita. Yeah? So that means there is a clear-cut hierarchy, there is a government, and ultimately, in a crisis situation, in all likelihoods, the president, prime minister, chancellor, it's called, is going to call the shots. In international politics, obviously, it's differently. So to put it differently, in international politics, there's even more of a need to manage together than in domestic setting. And yeah, then the non-state actors, they're in the book, there are quite a lot of them. Yeah. So say the new philosophers in France, they were very, very interventionist. And Chirac invited them to the Élysée and everything, and he had dinner with them formally, informally. So that definitely shaped his thinking quite a bit. And you also have all kinds of non-state actors, so journalists and everything, elder statesmen who are quite important. 15th of February 2003 clearly was a transnational thing. Yeah. In terms of the anti-war demonstrations. And it was then, that day, that Blair changed his framing stuff around. So to some extent, that did matter. Yeah. Perhaps but it's has something to do with that. I mean, as a concluding statement. Now, really entirely counterfactually, yeah, and it is a little normative. So there are lots and lots of actors now involved in what I said. Yeah, different state leaders, civil society, transnational, lots of them. In theory, that provides opportunities for good decision making. And if one thinks about the pattern there is, let's say, Iraq, probably a lot of things went wrong. Yeah, this is also where the height of contestation was. Yeah. So taking critics seriously rather than dismissing them makes for good or for better decision making. International politics does not come easy because leaders are usually not attuned to being won over or being persuaded by another leader. Some of it happens, but all in all, very little.
Well, thank you very much for your talk. Thank you for your questions. And I think we all enjoyed the book.
Thank you very much.